Peak human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
And we're back. Thanks for waiting patiently for Season 3. We have an all-star lineup of guests and many interviews already in the can ready to be released. To catch people up, I'm Brian Sanders, and I've quit my job and dedicated my life to studying health and nutrition. I'm trying my best to be unbiased and to simplify the conflicting advice out there and distill down concepts into something anyone can understand. I'm not a doctor or nutritionist. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I've lost both of my parents to chronic disease and have set off on my own path for the last 4 years to study this topic and make sure I don't fall to the same fate. My role is the curator, the communicator. I've interviewed over 100 of the top scientists, doctors, nutritionists, fitness experts, and other health professionals, and have come to find some simple truths that I'd like to share. A lot of this will be presented in the feature-length documentary called Food Lies, but it's not all about the film. I'm spreading this information to the public any way I can. I do this podcast. I post daily ideas and information on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and soon I'll be doing more videos on YouTube. Search for Food Lies on any of these platforms. Today I'm talking to Ryan Lowery, who is a PhD in health and human performance and a researcher studying cellular, molecular, and whole body changes in muscle size, strength, and power in response to novel nutrition, training, and supplement interventions. He's also the president of the Applied Science and Performance Institute, where he's bridging the gap between the latest research in science and practical application. He runs ketogenic.com, which is a great resource to check out. He's the guy that Lane Norton called out in a previous episode. I wanted to get him on to talk about the benefits of being fat adapted and why ketogenic diets are an effective tool in the arsenal. I was actually just hanging out with him at the Metabolic Health Summit. This was an awesome conference put on in part by Dr. Dom D'Agostino, who mentioned it last summer in Peak Human episode 6 that I did with him. The top scientists studying ketogenic metabolic therapy were there talking about their latest research and how, in conjunction with some other treatments, it has been used to shrink brain tumors, prevent epileptic seizures, and even reverse cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. Pretty amazing stuff. So a quick message about the film. Please go to foodlies.org and support us on Indiegogo as we finish post-production. We have to cover the cost of our amazing animators, graphic artists, and editors working away on this. I won't sell it anymore. Just know I make no money on this and have in fact spent every cent of my savings making it so far. I really appreciate your support. Here's Dr. Ryan Lowery. All right, well, Dr. Ryan Lowery, how are you doing today?
Doing great, man. Honored to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. It was great meeting you for 10 seconds in Ohio. I don't know if you even remember that. I came up to you, you're right about to go on stage. You probably had a lot on mind. You're about to do a presentation. And I don't even know why I came up to you.
I remember, man. I remember.
Yeah, I was like, hey, I'm making a film. And I was running around. The problem is I didn't get to see your presentation because I was trying to grab some other speakers and film with them upstairs. But what was it on?
It was basically on ketogenic therapies for longevity. We do we've done some new research looking at ketogenic diet and its effects on like longevity and factors associated with longevity.
I love that. Let's get into that a little later, but I guess we could kind of start at the top. I am making the film and I love the ketogenic diet. I just never consider myself a keto guy, right? I think it fits. I think there's a framework of nutrition and I'm all about like nutrient density and running on fat, and keto fits in that framework and it just is based on your goals. Is that sounds, are you hardcore keto? What is your stance on that?
Oh, for sure. No, I think it's very context dependent. I think there is a percentage, I think it's a small percentage of the population that can actually thrive off of a higher carbohydrate diet. These people are extremely insulin sensitive, usually very lean, jacked, and they have different goals than someone who might be like the majority of the population that's just like, hey, I want to try and improve body composition and not have so much fat mass. I really think a lot of this should be dictated by their insulin status. And unfortunately, I think a large majority of people tend to be more on the insulin resistant side than more insulin sensitive. But I am 100% in support of people that are insulin sensitive if they can, and their goals align with, hey, I want to eat a higher carbohydrate diet. This is the reason why I'm doing it. Then by all means, do it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's tons of context and there's preferences even. I do some health coaching and it's like, well, if this person doesn't like to eat meat and they're not into and it's like, exactly. And they're say like a cyclist and they love to eat tons of fruit and veg, let them do it.
Exactly right.
Awesome. So you have a research facility. What goes on there?
Yeah, so we have a facility called the Applied Science and Performance Institute. It's in Tampa, Florida, 22,000 square feet. Basically, imagine Disneyland for sports science and research, where we basically tried to take like the similar model to like ESPN Sports Science, where we have athletes, high net worth individuals that come in here and really are really getting after it training, but also using and researching the latest cutting edge science and equipment to how do we really take a look underneath the hood? How do we examine people on a whole body physiology and molecular level to say, hey, are they improving? What are some things that we can do to diagnose someone and say, hey, here's where you're at, or here's where you're limited in your biomechanics. Now here's what we need to implement. So really just kind of like state-of-the-art equipment that we try and really measure and take the guesswork out of human performance.
That's great. What are some recent things that have come out?
Well, right now, actually, one of the projects we're working on is stem cell therapy, which is, I think, going to be one of the new frontiers. A lot of it obviously depends on the type of stem cells, where they're coming from. We're looking at placental stem cells, placental-derived stem cells, mainly in sarcopenia and models of Parkinson's disease. So one of my big interests that I'm fascinated with, and this kind of goes back to the keto side of things, I am super fascinated with the neurological and neuroprotective benefits of some of these interventions, like potentially stem cells and like ketogenic therapies for people who have like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury. Like that's a big passion of mine.
Yeah. Well, that's really close to my heart. My mom is stage 4 Alzheimer's, and I'm about to go home today. Actually, I'm getting on a flight to Hawaii, and this is sort of her last legs. So it's kind of a sad time, but we're too late I was too late learning about all this, but I'm kind of doing it for myself. I am in and out of ketosis a lot, and I have thought about this a lot. And so I'm very interested in this side, and maybe you could do a refresher. I've had some other people on the podcast that talk about Alzheimer's, but how does that work? People call it type 3 diabetes these days.
Yeah, so it is being referred to as type 3 diabetes. And what we're seeing is this. Your brain, similar to what happens like in type 2 diabetes, certain cells become resistant to insulin, meaning that if insulin is even released, the cells are kind of like the door's still locked. The door's not opening for some reason. When insulin hits the cell, it should be opening. It's not. That's ultimately insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. But why they're referring to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes is because the brain elicits a very similar response. So your brain starts to be unable to effectively take up and utilize glucose as a fuel source. However, in these models, if you look at like both animal and human models that have Alzheimer's, ketone transport is unaffected. And so they're still able to take up and utilize ketones, which can be a fuel source utilized by the brain. And that's why in humans right now, really the only research that's being done is like on MCTs. But even just giving like coconut oil or MCTs can elicit huge improvements in their like cognitive clarity, because they get rapidly broken down into ketones, and those ketones are now fueling the brain.
Yeah, that's alternative source. So what do you think about preventing Alzheimer's in the first place by not becoming insulin resistant in the brain?
I think it's similar to whole body insulin resistance, is that living a healthy lifestyle, taking care of yourself in ways like, hey, eating the right nutrition, right? Like making sure you're optimizing nutrient intake and nutrient density. Also make sure you're exercising. Even exercising can be extremely advantageous for people with Alzheimer's and pre-Alzheimer's. So exercising, getting in like adequate amount of vitamin D, like getting out in the sun, eating right. A lot of it's just lifestyle interventions, similar to how we can be preventative for people developing type 2 diabetes. It's very similar, I would imagine, for Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I definitely believe that. It's all about not expressing those genes. I think our ancestors had all kinds of different genes. They just didn't express them because their environment, which was so in tune with what we're supposed to be living in. Yeah, what food, movement, sun, lack of toxins in the environments, all that stuff, right?
Exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's just, no one can say for sure that you're not going to get Alzheimer's if you live this way, but it seems very likely to me.
Yeah. It's just putting the odds more in your favor of like, hey, like things can always happen, but like I'm going to put myself in the best position possible to say, you know what, I at least am giving it the best. I'm doing whatever I can to give myself the best possible shot.
Exactly. And then what about Parkinson's?
Very similar, interestingly enough. So, very similar in regards to that it seems to be that one of the underlying root causes or one of the main contributors to development of Parkinson's is glucose intolerance or insulin resistance, where their brain isn't properly utilizing a certain fuel source. There's imbalances that go on in the neurochemistry of the brain. And how do you kind of equalize equalize some of those imbalances? We've actually done studies in our lab, which is pretty fascinating. There's been some animal models that have done like a ketogenic diet and seen a lot of improvements. We've done some case studies looking at like exogenous ketones and incorporating those in and seen like profound changes very, very rapidly. Literally like within like 30 minutes of giving exogenous ketones with someone with Parkinson's, we've actually seen in our case studies, obviously it varies for everyone, but like in case studies, their shaking stops. And like it's visibly like they're looking at themselves being like, what the heck just happened? I'm not shaking and I was 30 minutes or 45 minutes ago.
Wow, that's great. So I have a college friend who recently reached out to me, listens to the podcast, and said his dad has Parkinson's and asked for some advice. So is there anywhere I could send them, or is there any kind of tips?
Obviously, I think always working with they have to work with a physician that's supportive of what they're trying to do. But if it were in my case, I would definitely look into a ketogenic diet. There's pretty strong evidence now that that can be beneficial. And then just making sure they're getting in, if they're not going to utilize exogenous ketones, getting in high quality fats, like utilizing MCTs, utilizing coconut oil to try and provide that fuel source that ultimately may be able to help. And then as much as possible, obviously get in some exercise. Even if it's just walking, just getting in exercise would be helpful as well.
Yeah, that BDNF. Yeah, it sounds like this is prescriptions for anyone who wants to have better cognitive health and if they have any kind of problems. And you mentioned athletes and concussions. And yeah, I grew up playing football and had a few concussions. What do you think about, the NFL and all this other brain health stuff?
Yeah, so it's interesting. And we're working pretty closely with different organizations very tied in and close to the NFL regarding this. And the thing is, right now, I don't believe the solution is creating better helmets. That's a Band-Aid. The solution is finding what the root cause of the issue is. Because as much as we like to think that concussions or CT is developed because people get these huge hits, like the highlights you see on ESPN, like boom, someone gets depleted. Like, yeah, like clearly they have a concussion. But the people that are also suffering from it, think about linemen who have this repetitive hitting every single play. They're hitting heads over and over again. That starts to add up. And one of the things we know about traumatic brain injury is some trauma like that to the brain resembles what we just talked about in what you see in Alzheimer's. The brain becomes temporarily insulin resistant. The duration of that is variable depending upon the severity of the injury. But like if you take a big hit, your brain, the insulin receptors become not as functional and you're not able to take up and utilize glucose as a fuel source. But what do they all have on the sidelines? A ton of sugar, a ton of these things. And they're trying to fuel with those when in reality, their brain can't take up and utilize that fuel source. So what happens? It's ultimately like starvation in the face of plenty. Like you think you're giving a ton of fuel, but your brain's still starving. And that's over time starts to accumulate and you get all these plaques being built up. You start seeing some of these things build up. And then we see years down the road, CTE and some of these other complications start to develop.
Yeah, so it seems like anyone in this line of work, that's their job to get hit. It would be better if they were running on fat probably and getting their brain what it needs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of neuroprotective benefits of fat. And ultimately what fat breaks down to is ketones. There's plenty, if you look at like ketones and brain injury, you search any of these aspects on like Google Scholar, there's tons of research papers showing that like there is potentially a big neuroprotective effect of ketones on the brain. And that stems from getting in these high quality fats into people's diets.
Yeah, and there's a lot of studies showing that athletes do just as well on a ketogenic diet, right, after they get adjusted. And Finney and Volek did a lot of these early studies. And I think that's where you got your start. You saw a presentation by Volek, and they said they didn't have any research on resistance training.
Exactly right. And so we were at a conference almost 10 years ago now where Dr. Volek and Dr. Finney were presenting on ketogenic dieting and endurance athletes. And they were presenting some of their early data. And someone in the audience asked, hey, like, what about resistance training? And that's when Dr. Volek was like, well, to date, there really isn't any. And that's when Jacob and I were like, hey, you know what? We got to start researching this stuff. Let's dive down that rabbit hole and see what happens. And I went in a complete skeptic. Like, I was an athlete my entire college career. I was probably just drinking in weight gainer shakes alone, probably 250 grams of carbohydrates a day. Like, I was trying to load up because I was always small. And my coach was like, I need you to put on size. I need you to put on size. So I was like the complete opposite of keto when I was playing sports. And I was like, there's no way. Like, I've always been taught and told, like, you need a bunch of carbohydrates in order to perform. But to your point, like, yeah, like when you have a well-formulated ketogenic diet and you properly allow time for individuals to adapt, meaning that you're not just doing it for 1 week or 2 weeks, you allow a proper adaptation period, you don't see any differences in performance.
Yeah. And some people in some sport, it's better to be fat adapted because you have that long sustained fuel source.
Absolutely. I think like you mentioned, long duration endurance activities, like some of these people who do like Ironmans and these crazy, crazy long distance runs, like for me, it would be an absolute no brainer because if you think about it, if you're able to tap into and you're fat adapted and you're able to tap into the fuel source that it doesn't matter how lean you are, you have thousands and thousands of calories available from fat. You just need to be able to tap into that. But if you're so carbohydrate dependent, and then you have to chew on all these gummies and put in all these gels and stuff like that just to try and keep that glycogen up, that's going to be a lot harder than saying, you know what, like maybe you can go a little bit longer and be able to tap into your body's own fuel reserve, which is your body fat.
Yeah, they're not metabolically flexible. People don't really know what metabolic flexibility is. And these people who are dependent on carbs and glucose they're never really burning their own fat.
Exactly.
So, and to be flexible, you burn your fat mostly, but that's not saying you can't tap into glucose when you need it. So these athletes can use targeted glucose if their need to have these quick spurts of energy or, for different reasons, you can still live in a fat adapted state, but then use glucose when you need it.
Exactly right. And that's how I like to look at it. Like, I think a lot of times people because it's like one way or the other. Like a lot of times people like to look at it as black or white, but like, I think carbohydrates can be an extremely effective tool. I think people should look at them as a tool versus like, oh, this is absolutely essential, but they are a tool and can certainly help with performance. That's been demonstrated over and over again. Even just like, there's even some data that just swishing around carbohydrates in your mouth, like carbohydrate mouth rinses can improve performance. So yeah, I agree. I think you can still be fat adapted and utilize carbohydrates strategically when you need an extra boost in performance.
Yeah, I love that. So I guess this kind of leads me into this whole Lane Norton thing because you guys have gone back and forth online and it is kind of this war that seems a little unnecessary because I think everyone's goals are to be healthy and good information about, nutrition and being optimum. So my view is I don't think keto is the only way to go, but I think that fat adaptation is better. I've looked at all sides of this. I think that it is better to be fat adapted. And yes, it's not like all carbs are bad. It's not like you can never have carbs again and that it's evil. It's just get metabolically flexible, eat a nutrient-dense diet, and you can burn glucose if you need it, but it's better to primarily run on fat. And there's so many benefits. So let's talk about all these different benefits and refute some of Lane's points.
Yeah, and I think the main thing to keep in mind here is this. There are people who are metabolically superior and can eat anything and everything and they'll be completely fine. That's not the majority of the population.
Yeah.
And so like to your point, and what we talked about earlier, like we really need to start looking at people's like insulin sensitivity. Like how are they able to respond to certain nutrients, whereas someone else may not be able to respond to those nutrients. And I'm in agreement with you that I don't think everyone in the world needs to be on a ketogenic diet. I don't think that that's an absolute necessity. But I do like what you mentioned, like fat adaptation, being able to lower carbohydrate intake. Like I think it's insanity for most people to say, oh, I need 300 plus grams of carbohydrates per day. And they're not exercising. They're like sitting on their butt all day. It's like, hey, where else do I get the calories from? I think that's a terrible recommendation. And I think that there's very few people in the world that probably need more than that. And to be recommending like those types of levels, I just don't see that there's any physiological reason why that should be a recommendation of like, hey, let's look into lowering carbohydrate intake, increasing high quality fat sources, and make sure we're getting in ample amounts of high quality protein.
Yeah, there's almost no argument with that.
Mm-hmm.
And he also some of these guys that say that they're anti-zealots, they're anti-zealot zealots. So I think all he's doing is cherry picking stuff that fits his narrative, right? He accuses people of doing the same thing, but it's, well, you're just doing that just to fit your nothing matters, everything's the same, carbs and fat are the same narrative. And he's also coming in the context of people who are insulin sensitive, they're in shape, they're athletes, they're bodybuilders, they burn tons of calories each day and they can afford to eat some of these carbs.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, the point is there's people who people follow on social media and it becomes like dogma of like, you say like, hey, whatever they say, it must be true.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage people, like even people that listen to me on social media, I'm like, go, like, here's the research, or hey, go look into this on your own, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the biggest things a scientist can say is like, I don't know. Like you have to ask someone else or go look into it yourself. And the thing about it is like, I don't have any beef with, for me to get angry about someone, like I'd have to actually care
Mm-hmm.
deeply about them. Like it's just, I'm so beyond that and focused on everything positive that we're doing. But at the same token, I think there are people who have a voice on social media. And when they have a voice on social media, they need to be very careful with it and teach other people how to respectfully and appropriately address whatever topic it may be. It may have nothing to do with health and nutrition, but when you have a voice and people are following you or like listening to your word, I feel there's a deep obligation and responsibility to, yes, lead them and put out the best quality information as possible, but do it in the right way that teaches them lessons beyond just the topic that you're talking about. Not calling people names, cussing every 5 seconds, calling people idiot. Like that doesn't set a good example for people that are really trying to learn and follow. So I just think there's a better way to approach it.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I mean, he's building his brand doing all those tactics, and I don't really agree with it, but I wanted to talk to him to see if we could come to some common ground, and we kind of did, but I don't know. I just don't really agree with him. And so can you talk about some of the studies that show that when you're looking at equivalent calories and equivalent protein, that there is a difference between the fat and carb makeup of your diet?
Definitely. And right now they're limited in some capacity, but there are several. And so one of the first ones that I brought up that was a very small sample size, but still showed trends. And if you actually analyze the data, believe it or not, there actually is significance. But it was a study literally done in 1971 by Young et al. And it was a very, very small population. They matched calories, they matched protein intake, and they saw that the individuals who were on the lowest carbohydrate restriction, they were having about 30 grams per day, saw the greatest amount of fat loss. Mm-hmm. So that kind of led trends into go, hey, what else? What other studies are there? And since then, there's probably been about like 4 or 5. I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but like there have been, even recently, there's a study by Gregory, one of my colleagues, Dr. Rachel Gregory, and she basically did a study in CrossFit athletes where, again, no significant differences in total calories, no significant differences in total protein. And they saw that the ketogenic dieting group saw a greater decrease in fat mass and no differences in performance. Our labs saw very similar findings. No differences in total calories, no differences in protein. Ketogenic diet saw a greater decrease in fat mass when looking at over 10 weeks at what happened. So there's been multiple studies that have looked at this. It's very difficult to do. Like one of the caveats, or one of the things people bring up is like, oh, well, they must not be tracking right. Well, here's the thing. In real world practical application, there's probably 0.05% of the population will legitimately track everything down to the gram and calorie. It's very, very impractical type of research to do. So one of my things is I like to point out those studies that show, hey, even there are studies that show when you truly match for protein and calories, there does seem to be some differences. However, in the grand scheme of things, the studies that don't match, studies that allow subjects to kind of like self-select, my question is that necessarily a bad thing? Oh, well, the only reason why the ketogenic dieting group saw greater benefit is because they had higher protein intake. Well, if it's self-selected and they're selecting out higher protein foods, is that necessarily a bad thing? Like, that's real world practical application to go out to someone and say, hey, here's some recommendations. Like, here's where you want to like lower your carbohydrates to, make sure you bump up your fat and getting in high quality protein. And people self-select out like higher amounts of protein and see better benefits, more satiety because of that. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing.
100% agree. It's almost like I don't really care that much if you're looking at these scientific scenarios that are controlled, when real world, there's way more benefits in many studies from being fat adapted. And yeah, so what? They're spontaneously eating fewer calories. Well, who cares? No one in America really cares these details, these numbers. They care that they're losing weight and feeling great.
Exactly. And that's another huge point is like, oh, well, they're eating a lower amount of calories. Cool. That's great. We have a problem right now in America that people are eating too many calories. So if they can self-select and they're just eating foods that they feel fuller on and they're not getting as hungry all the time and they're losing weight, and you want to say, oh, it's attributed to the lower calorie amount, phenomenal. Whatever you want to attribute it to, they're losing more calories, and that's practical application. So I think to your point, like, that's a big take home that I hope people take away is like, cool. So what? You want to argue everything under the sun. At the end of the day, like, if that's the recommendation and people are self-selecting it on their own, I'm 100% in support of it, because that's practical real world application. And that's what can get out to the masses and help change a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. And I go back and forth in this. I don't know if we're going to know anytime soon exactly if it's better or not, but this real world stuff should be what we're going off of until we can figure it out. But what do you think? So some people say that it's all about the deficit, that all these changes come from the deficit. Like, why I got extra lean, I have more energy, my brain worked better, all these things. Can that really be attributed just to a deficit that I was creating by eating a ketogenic diet?
Could be. Like, here's the thing. And I think the bigger question is like the calories. Like, oh, is it just that you're not consuming as many calories and you're burning more calories? If you want to get really, really granular, yes, at some level that's likely involved. Yeah. But there is no way to scientifically 100% accurately measure that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter we've worked with the best equipment in the world. It does not matter what you utilize. There's been you can put people in a metabolic ward. There's been studies, and oftentimes individuals on social media like to reference studies like this, where they put people in metabolic wards, and their goal was to have them was to maintain weight. Their goal was, hey, we don't want them to make any significant changes. They calculated their daily energy expenditure, prescribed them. They're in a metabolic ward. Mm-hmm. They're giving them the food that they're eating, and they still lost weight. Mm-hmm. So it's like the equations of like, oh, it's like the calories in, calories out thing. At some level, yes, you're probably right. Can you practically identify that? I think it's impossible to practically do that with any type of modern technology.
Yeah. So energy balance, there's always got to be some kind of energy balance going on, and there's so many different variables, and I don't think anyone's saying that we're breaking the laws of physics, right? Maybe some, uneducated people who just started keto like 10 days ago think that they're defying physics somehow. But really, right. There's just so much going on. There's so many different factors of energy expenditure and hormone and this and that going on. But mainly, I don't like his message that all calories are the same. That's like, it kind of comes down to everything's the same. So it's kind of just like eat whatever you want. And I think that's the worst general advice you can give, because I'm so focused on nutrient density. I've did all this ancestral stuff and looking at modern science and looking at just myself and people around me and how much benefits there are to eating a nutrient dense diet. And that's what we should be focused on.
100%. And that statement is false. It is actually absolutely 100% incorrect that all calories are the same, because it's funny, there's actually research that was done. Lane actually did a study. His entire dissertation was looking at, cool, what happens when you give wheat protein versus whey protein? And you see a significant difference in body composition, obviously due to likely like you're increasing protein synthesis with one and you're not doing it with the other. So to say that all calories are the same, if I give you if I give you all your protein from whey versus all of your protein from wheat, you'll see a difference. If I give you all of your fat from bacon, or I give you all of your fat from MCTs, put aside the fact that you'd probably be running to the bathroom every second, there would be a major difference. Like the way that these things interact inside of the body have profound differences that ultimately, yes, they factor into that equation of, oh, this energy balance thing. They factor it in, but like no one can determine the actual rate at which those things are factored in and to what degree.
Yeah, it's so important. And there's studies that show that our ancestors ate 10 to 20 times more vitamins and minerals than we do. And they were strong and robust. And, you know, if you're talking about, oh, just hit your macros, you can just eat whey protein and, you know, just some rice as a fuel source. And then you're hitting your macros or something like that. But that's just going to lead to poor health problems.
Right. And I think there's a lot of stuff with if it fits your macros that I don't even want to. It would be a whole laundry list. But the same token, like what I have a very big concern, I'll say, is that people that are in the mindset of if it fits your macros, what happens, and I know for like even Lane talks like, hey guys, don't do this. But unfortunately, it's the mindset and stigma around it of like, hey, I have X amount of fat left on the day. I have X amount of carbohydrates. I have X amount of protein. And then they're like, oh, I need to make sure I hit these macros before I go to sleep when they're not hungry. They're just like, oh, I need to hit my macros. And then they go and they get half a serving of Reese's Pieces and a serving of a Kit Kat bar just to hit their macros. I'm like, is that truly beneficial? Because they're just trying to hit their macronutrients. And like you said, not focusing on high nutrient dense foods. It's just macro, 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 macro. And at the end of the day, it's like, I'd rather someone focus on intuitive eating and understanding that there's more things like nutrient density that matter. Like, yeah, if I get 100 grams of carbohydrates from vegetables versus 100 grams of carbohydrates from Fruit Loops, there's going to be a significant difference in the metabolic response to those two things, regardless of the fact that they're both the same quote unquote macros.
Yeah, exactly. And then what are some other reasons you think fat is a better fuel source? Because I definitely do. And I definitely think, you know, there's something to do with this. Well, maybe you're just naturally creating a deficit by eating like this or consuming less. But I still think there's benefits in running on fat. And that's what we have done for all of time. I kind of stumped Lane. I said, well, he said that glucose is the preferred fuel source. And I said, well, that's not true. Well, we can only store a finite amount of calories as glycogen in our liver or muscles, but we can store basically unlimited fat, and that this is our preferred fuel source. Humans run like batteries. This is how we lived for millions of years. So yeah, what do you think are the benefits of running on fat?
Yeah, and I do think so. And actually, if you give both ketones and glucose at the same time, there are some tissues that preferentially take up and utilize ketones in preference of, or before glucose. I think the benefits of fat, one of the benefits that we talked about is, like, I do think that fat being broken down and converted over into things like ketones provide a satiation effect. Like, people are fuller, so they're ultimately not eating as much all the time. Additionally, you look at like sources of fat, and people oftentimes, like, I grew up in the mindset of like, oh, if you don't eat fat, you won't get fat. And what that led to, and people, if they're not getting adequate amounts of fat and they're very, very low fat, we talked about a little bit, it's hormonal imbalances. Like, you can destroy testosterone by not eating fat. Like, you need the cholesterol as a precursor in order to help synthesize testosterone, and even for females as well, hormonal regulation. But like, fat is very, very important in hormonal function. And I think limiting it and being extremely restrictive with it can be very detrimental to someone's health.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you need fat, then why not? If we know we need fat, you don't need carbs. So that's a good indicator of which you should be running on. But also, you think it's a cleaner burning fuel source?
I think ketones are a cleaner burning fuel source. So I think the byproduct of fat is a cleaner burning fuel source, meaning that the amount of energy that's generated on a per calorie basis from ketones than carbohydrates, I think ketones are way more efficient.
Mm-hmm. And any other benefits that pop out to you that just people find more sustained energy or?
Yeah, more sustained energy. I think having things like phospholipids are very neuroprotective, and that could be one of the reasons why people are seeing those cognitive benefits. Is there's things like phosphatidylcholine and these cholines that are in some fat sources that can be extremely beneficial. Getting in omega-3 fatty acids can be extremely beneficial for a wide variety of different things, which can be found in various different foods that tend to be higher in fat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, I think we just went so wrong with the last 50 years and these low fat products and just going back to fat. I think it's just more natural in general. It's just people think that they're doing okay. And that's just because they're younger and they're kind of insulin sensitive for now. But all this stuff catches up to them. And it's so hard to quantify that and let people know. It's like, okay, yeah, you're doing fine now. But what about later? Why is there such a huge problem in America with all these people?
Right. And I think the guidelines are extremely faulty. And like we don't even have to go into the history of like the Ansel-Keys conundrum, but in essence, it was correlational data that was inappropriately misinterpreted. And that data then led to, hey, here's the food pyramid, here's the recommendations, low fat, everything. And ultimately, we're facing we're coming out of it, but we saw a lot of the problems come in where all these foods started to become low fat, low fat, low fat, low fat. And in order to make them somewhat edible, what do you do? What do you have to do? When you cut out fat, you have to add in a bunch of carbohydrates in order to make it like, hey, this actually tastes really good. So yeah, exactly. I agree to your point that we were at a point where we were probably eating a lot more high quality sources of fat. And then what happened was we got recommendations and we were like, all right, let's do this. And then boom. And I think we're starting to finally come out of that hole.
Yeah, it's just hard. I just get a lot of pushback. People just thinking that they're fine and they're eating this supposed balanced diet. And I just kind of think that one day it's not going to be fine. As you grow older, you're less tolerant to all the carbohydrates.
Absolutely. You absolutely are. You tend to see people who, as we age, we become, especially if people aren't exercising, which is probably a larger majority than is, unfortunately. But you start to see these people become more and more insulin resistant and they can't tolerate. There's a reason why, and I'm sure, I don't know if you were the same way, but like when I was growing up and I was like 10 years old, I could pound sweet as fish and Skittles and all these things. And yeah, I was running around a lot, but like I was extremely insulin sensitive at the time. Whereas like my 75-year-old grandfather probably couldn't have an entire bag of sweet as fish right now and be like, oh yeah, I'm fine. I feel great. This is great.
Yeah, and there's even some fruit fly studies. I forget the doctor's name that's doing them recently that was showing that when you're younger, you are more adapted to these modern way of eating and refined carbs and all this stuff. But as you grow older, you just need to eat a more ancestral diet. And
it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. So what do you say to the haters? So I have friends, even my friends, like no one, it's weird how friends and family listen to you the least. But they just think this stuff is bogus or like, oh, this is some weird thing or it doesn't work or they tried it and they gained weight because they did it wrong. Like, what do you say to that?
I ultimately, like, I'm not going to force anyone. I don't want it to be like a cult of like, hey, you have to come in, like, or else I'm never speaking to you again. It's just like, hey, I want, especially when it's friends and family. Like I go, listen, the only thing I want is to look out for your best interest. I can't make you. I do this with my brother. My brother's extremely overweight. And I tell him, I said, bud, I can't make you go to the gym. I can't make you eat better quality foods. I said, but like ultimately it's getting them to think about what they want. They don't care what you want. Like, even though I want my brother to be in great shape and healthy, like ultimately he has to want that. And so I go to him and I'm like, Steve, like, eventually someday you might want a family. Like you might want to run around with your kids. And like right now, that's certainly not possible. So like getting them to think about what they want and understanding like, hey, listen, whatever method that we can do to get there that's allowing you to sustain it and make this a lifestyle rather than a temporary fix, I'm 100% in support of it. And just being there as a level of support within itself helps them tremendously.
I like that. So like I said, I'm not a straight keto guy, but I definitely want to be fat adapted. So I end up kind of being more liberal on the weekends and then being clean on the weekdays. And I think you specifically did research on cyclic keto and that it's actually, you're not back in ketosis until like Thursday or something. Is that right?
Right. And so that one of the things I'm just very hesitant about, and there's a lot of factors that go into this. There's a lot of people who go, oh, I'm just going to go keto Monday through Friday and then blow it out on the weekends. And usually on the weekends, like I said, for the majority of we might be different. Like I get in workouts typically on Saturday or Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't. They're like, cool, it's off time. I'm going to hang out with the fam, do whatever I need to do. But we did study where we looked at a cyclic ketogenic diet where people were eating keto Monday through Friday and then carving up on the weekends. And they didn't see as good of results because they were knocked out of ketosis and they didn't get back in until like Thursday of the following week.
Yeah. Okay. So what if I don't care about being ketosis? I talk about accidental ketosis. I've never measured, I've never tried, I've never tracked calories, I've never done anything. And I found great success by just eating nutrient dense foods. If you're just eating high quality animal products and vegetables, you're going to kind of accidentally be there. So what do you think about that? Just not caring about the actual ketosis part.
Definitely. And if you're likely in a surplus and you're eating, like you said, high quality protein and you're getting in enough, it may not be, and you don't care about being in the state, you're just like kind of like lower carb, completely fine. One of the things that we saw though in this study is that they were in a calorie deficit. So oftentimes what you see when people are dieting down, we want to replicate like, hey, two people are dieting down maybe for like a competition or for a show or for a wedding. And what happens oftentimes in those situations is you're more prone to losing muscle. And what we found was the individuals who were on a cyclic ketogenic diet lost more muscle than those who were more on like a stricter ketogenic diet, because one of the properties of ketones is that they're very muscle sparing. So they help spare muscle tissue from being broken down, and very important amino acids for building muscle tissue. They help in that regard. So if you're dieting and you're like going on like a really, really lower calorie diet, then I wouldn't recommend you do that, because you're kind of just sitting on the fence in, right? You're not like fully carb adapted. You're not fully keto adapted. But if you're eating like complete, like a base normal, or you're trying to put on size, then I wouldn't think that it would be an issue.
And then what about if you're just at maintenance? If you're at your goal weight and you, over the course of the week, you're at equivalent, right? You're not a deficit or a surplus.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the route that someone takes, I think it's completely fine. I think what I would do is I would incorporate in, going back to metabolic flexibility, I would incorporate in carbohydrates more strategically throughout the week rather than solely on the weekend, because there is some degree, and even if you're incorporating in weekly, the degree at which this might happen, maybe, I don't know the time course of when you start becoming down regulating these insulin producers, so to speak. But you do, in some essence, like when you're on a long-term ketogenic diet, temporarily become what people might say, oh, you become insulin resistant, meaning that your pancreas isn't secreting as much insulin. So that's why I don't recommend people. I've said this multiple times. We're like, hey, we're the holidays, any holiday, usually people are like, I'm going to go really, really, really strict and then just blow it out on the holiday. And I'm like, I actually think that can be worse than if you like slowly start to introduce some carbohydrates and allow your body to start recognizing that and secreting a little bit of insulin and allowing your pancreas to kind of be like, oh, yep, I'm recognizing this. So that way you can handle that huge glucose load versus like, hey, I haven't had glucose, like a bunch of glucose in my system. And then all of a sudden you have 700 grams of carbohydrates. And it's just like, dang, that
your body.
hurt.
Yeah. Well, that was the one point Lane tried to bring up. He said that, oh yeah, well, if keto people fail a glucose tolerance test, it's like if you have a huge bolus of glucose that,
Of course.
yeah, because yeah, I know that's not really proving that they're not metabolically flexible.
Correct. And the way to look at it as well is that those studies are like when you're looking at oral glucose tolerance tests, that's whole body insulin sensitivity. If you look at like a cellular level, like the cells are more sensitive to insulin. So I think at a cellular level, these individuals are likely more insulin sensitive, meaning that maybe they don't need as much insulin to dispose of that glucose than they did prior to being in a ketogenic state. But yes, it's the same thing as if I give someone 750 grams of carbohydrates per day, and they're eating a very low fat diet, and I give them a huge bolus of fat, they're not going to be able to handle that fat very, very well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one more thing I wanted to ask about is people transitioning. I'm helping people around me. I have a good friend who kind of has like gut problems eating this way. You know, maybe it's just too much fat, or do you think it's a kind of a microbiome thing going on that needs to change? I know some people like Michaela Peterson mentioned she had diarrhea for like a month or something when she started doing her all meat thing, or it's just, you got to get used to just a ton of fat.
Yeah, I think there's definitely differences in gut microbiome. Like I think your gut microbiome is going to change based on what you're eating. What I would say is look at the quality of foods that you're eating and what exactly are you eating. Like the first time I did keto, and this was very, very long time ago, but there was not a lot of resources of like what constitutes a well-formulated ketogenic diet. So the only thing I ate, I had 4 meals per day, and it was what I called keto mousse, which was heavy cream, unsweetened dark chocolate, coconut oil, and whey protein. And like that's literally for the first 2 weeks, that's all I ate. And I felt like trash. It was awful. Like it was the worst thing. I was like, this sucked. I felt my stomach was always bloated and felt like crap. I'm like, dang, this keto thing sucks. But like, there's a lot of other things that I was missing. I mean, I was eating heavy cream and like a bunch of these fats and very little other nutrients. I wasn't supplementing with electrolytes. A bunch of stuff was going on, but I just didn't know any better.
Yeah. So mainly, yeah, people just have to be mindful and do a little research before they start it and maybe transition slowly, use electrolytes and use whole foods with high nutrient value.
Exactly right. And that's the main premise where I think it's becoming your own scientist. That's what I try and encourage people as much as possible. Learn and understand your body, because what works for someone else may not exactly work for you. And so it's one of the reasons why right now there's this huge carnivore craze, and I get asked about it all the time. Like, what do you think about people that are eating just all meat? And I'm like, hey, well, at the end of the day, it's an elimination diet in some capacity. You're eliminating literally everything but meat, which doesn't have no one has allergies to meat. But does that mean that it's optimal? No, I think you might be able to utilize that as a tool, but then I've never heard of anyone that's like, oh, I eat avocado and I feel like trash. I think cool, incorporate back in avocado, find out exactly what's causing you the issue, and then you have 2 options. You either completely eliminate that food item, or you say, I'm going to go super aggressive on fixing my gut microbiome so it can handle these types of nutrients and it can handle maybe higher amounts of fiber, and I'm going to try and do everything possible to address the root cause. So you ultimately have one of 2 decisions of like, I'm either going to eliminate it or I'm going to try and address the root cause of the issue.
Yeah, I think that's the better route. You don't want to be on these really restrictive diets forever, and then your gut microbiome changes so much that you can't really go back to eating more foods later. And don't get into a camp. Some of these people, they're like, all plants are bad. And like you said, avocado, like I don't think there's really anything bad with avocado. I don't know why we need to be dogmatic like a vegan, but in the opposite regard.
That's the one part I don't love. I'm like, what the heck's going on right now? And one of the things I try and do is be a voice in between, being like, hey, there are vegans and vegetarians who like, hey, if that's your choice or that's your preference for some reason, cool. You do your thing. There's no need to bash meat and say people who eat meat are the devil. But the same thing now has to go with the carnivores of being like, listen, just because someone ate a piece of broccoli doesn't mean that they're stupid. It just means like it's okay. Like there can be a middle ground between everyone.
All right. So you mentioned longevity in the very beginning. So before we go out, why don't you mention some of those studies and benefits?
Yeah. So right now, we actually did a study where we basically took animals And we took them from where they were about the human equivalent of, it would be the average of like a 30, maybe 25, 30-year-old person. And we put them on either a standard diet or a ketogenic diet for literally their entire lives, and played it out and just let them kind of die off, and then looked inside at all the different tissues, organs, etc. And what we found was those who were on a ketogenic diet for literally their entire life lived significantly longer. And when you looked at things like visceral adipose tissue, which is the amount of fat that's surrounding like the organs, you saw a significantly lower amount of visceral adipose tissue in these animals. Like literally, we have pictures. We always talk about this at conferences, but like you cut it open and it literally looks like something out of a textbook. And these are like old animals, and it looks like something out of a textbook. Whereas you look at like the standard American diet equivalent, and there's fat all around their tissue. It doesn't look good. But even just like a standard diet, which is higher in protein, maybe average in carbs, average in fat, there was still some visceral adipose tissue that wasn't even close to what you saw like on a ketogenic diet.
That's all. I think that's what happened to me. I told this story with Lane, but I was eating low carb for years and was thin and athletic and fine. And then when I actually got fat adapted, I think all my visceral fat disappeared. I was losing weight I didn't even know I had, and it felt extra amazing.
That's and we see that you can really only look at that with like a DEXA, and we see it all the time when people DEXA. It's like ultimately that's the type of fat that you want to be more concerned about. Like what we see on people is not, that's regular adiposity, whereas visceral, that's going to be like around your organs and around things like your liver. Like that's more alarming, and around your heart. That is more alarming than like, oh, wow, my love handle is a little bit bigger today. Usually they coincide. Don't get me wrong. Usually they coincide. But visceral adipose tissue, that is more concerning and something you want to try and address.
Yeah, definitely. That's a dangerous one. And that's why people can be thin on the outside and fat on the inside, which Lane disregarded. He called out Professor Tim Noakes as a liar and said that he didn't ever have diabetes or prediabetes. And that he said that there's no such thing as thin people who have metabolic problems. And it's insane. Like you can have fatty liver disease. That's the whole thing, is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We didn't even know it could exist, but it's because of exactly this, a visceral fat around your liver.
Yeah, I have the utmost respect for Prof. Noakes, and ultimately one of the greatest scientists of all time to live, because he literally was a huge advocate for carbohydrates and completely changed his stance once he became more and more educated about it, and has literally probably forgotten more than I'll ever learn in my life. So he's a very good friend and colleague, but I would never, ever even fathom calling that man a liar.
Yeah, and I agree. It was such an honor to spend time with him in Ohio when I saw you. But thank you so much. And I know your message is about positivity, and you've been very positive today. You never bash Lane or anyone. So yeah, I just like that message.
I appreciate it, man. And look, at the end of the day, there's always going to be people in your life, no matter what industry, no matter where you are. At the end of the day, it's ultimately the bigger person who takes the high road, and it ultimately comes down to what you're about. I know you do this podcast. I know it takes time, it takes energy, it takes a lot of effort, but you're trying to put out information to try and help people understand and get a better foundation and say, hey, I'm interviewing these people, or I'm talking to these people about various different topics. At the end of the day, the goal should be to serve and help others. And there's no room for negativity when you're trying to truly help other people and put their best interests first.
Absolutely. That's all we're trying to do. We have the same goals here. Yeah, just helping people. And you own ketogenic.com. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so we do a lot on ketogenic.com, just putting out free information about the ketogenic diet, a bunch of infographics and stuff like that. But on Instagram, you can find me at Ryan P. Lowery. Lowery, and then Facebook, it's Dr. Ryan Lowery on Facebook. And we actually just started the YouTube channel, which is we're going to start doing a lot more video content, because I think people like that and like to listen to a lot of video content and watch it. So those are the main ways you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think you got to go right about now, and hopefully I'll see you again sometime.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
And that's another episode of The Books. Come back next week for some more juicy nutrition talk. Please support the Food Lies film by clicking through the link in the show notes or going to foodlies.org. Leave a review on your podcast app or iTunes for this podcast. It really helps. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube by searching for Food Lies, and I'll catch you next time.